Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Coming this week from Al Jazeera in Doha with a special edition to mark the International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists. It's an event organized by dozens of media freedom and civil liberties groups. They're out to stop the persecution, abduction, and in too many cases, the killing of journalists at the hands of people who are seldom, if ever, prosecuted for their crimes, let alone convicted. There have been 14 journalists murdered in Syria and Iraq alone over the past year, not just the ones killed in front of the cameras for propaganda reasons. We've seen kidnappings and intimidation of reporters trying to cover the story in Ukraine, media workers arrested and targeted in Somalia. And it's not always the political story at issue. The drug trade makes journalism in Mexico very dangerous work. We'll have more on those countries later, but first, we're going to report on some of our own. The story, Egypt, and the Al Jazeera Three. Mohammed Fahmy, Peter Gresta, and Bahar Mohammed remain in prison facing years in jail, convicted after a legal process that featured all the hallmarks of a show trial. In the second half of our program, I'll be interviewing Abdullah al-Shami, a reporter with our sister channel, Al Jazeera Arabic, who spent 309 days in jail in Egypt, half of them on hunger strike, although he was never actually charged with a crime. Now free, he's living here in Qatar. But we start with our colleagues who remain behind bars in Cairo. In his message, smuggled out of his jail cell, Peter Gresta wasn't just talking about his imprisonment alongside his Al Jazeera colleagues. And he wasn't talking about Egypt alone, because Egypt is not alone in persecuting journalists. He was referring to the James Foleys, the Stephen Sotlofs, and the scores of other lesser-known journalists who've been targeted or killed, sometimes by militants, sometimes by the governments those militants are out to overthrow. Hence the message from Gresta: journalists are no longer on the front lines, we are the front lines.
I think what Peter Gresta meant in his message is that journalists now are becoming the story. And it's not about what they write, it's not about how critical or independent they perform their job. They are always targets for the governments in the Middle East.
Gresta also says if you try to understand the other side in the government's point of view, you're committing an act of treason. And that has meant that journalists have become the front lines.
What Peter is saying is reflective of the environment today in Egypt and how the new regime is dealing with any alternative storytelling, independent and reflective, coming from media, especially from international media.
Here's the job description for an Egyptian journalist, as stated by President el-Sisi himself just last week.
لازم المصريين الثقة والرضا والطموح والشعور بالأمان يبقى دايما الإعلام بيتكلم فيه من غير ما أنا بقولش إن هو يزيف حاجة لكن يخلي باله برضه بيتكلم.
In many ways, he thinks of the media as one of the institutions that should work along his side in order to satisfy his agenda and improve the situation. In that video, when he was talking, he basically tells the journalists, help Egyptians, as if journalists are his people that are working under him to satisfy his message. That shows the mentality of President al-Sisi as a military officer who thinks the whole country is working under his leadership.
Step over the line, and like talk show host Mahmoud Saad, you'll be taken off the air. Al Nahar TV dumped him last week for, quote, demotivating the army. The week before, another private channel, Dream 2, did not even wait for Wael al-Ibrashi's show to end. It pulled the plug mid-broadcast because of what he later called political pressure. The channel just went to black. In the days of Tahrir Square, blogger Ala Abdel Fattah was credited with helping organize the protests. His sister was an editor on a documentary about the Arab Spring. They both took part in protests after the fall of the Muslim Brotherhood and were among 24 people jailed for that this past week. Their mother and their sister are on a hunger strike. You can find them outside the Supreme Court. And journalists don't have to take part in demonstrations to pay the price. All you have to do, like Mahmoud Abu Zaid, is point your camera at one.
Mahmoud Abu Zaid, a photographer, a local press photographer, was arrested while he was doing his job. He was taking photos from street on the protest, on the crackdown by the security forces against protesters. And he is in detention since 14 months now with no due process, with no charges against him. He's a good example of how the regime is dealing now with media, with dealing with journalists who are trying simply to do their job.
Journalists going to cover Muslim Brotherhood protests and protests on the other side for the Egyptian government. You're not being an objective journalist, you're just taking one side against the other. It's you're promoting one side against us.
Specific to the case against the Al Jazeera 3, some articles have emerged online over the past few weeks reporting cracks in the case for the defense. One said that one of the defendants, Bahar Mohammed, provided testimony that was more critical of the network's journalism in Egypt than the evidence his colleagues gave, although that was not reported at the time of the trial. Another online report, different site, same writer, said Al Jazeera's management bore some responsibility for sending a coverage team into Egypt without the required accreditation. The network's response? If that was the crime, the punishment does not fit.
It's insidious to try and put the blame on those journalists or on their employer. The reality is that those guys are in jail because the Egyptian authorities want them in jail. And no matter how often you point to paperwork or anything else that might have happened or not happened, the fact is that even if you accept that the paperwork might not have been perfect, that's a slap on the wrist. That's a fine. If it was really bad, you can deport the guys. You don't put them in jail for 7 and 10 years.
As for the rest of the media in Egypt, most seem content, or at least willing, to march to the beat of el-Sisi's drum. Whether they're reporting on the suicide bomb that recently killed dozens of soldiers in the Sinai, or the students who are among the few Egyptians willing to rise above the parapet and protest what is happening in their country.
Since the attack on the soldiers in Sinai, which has claimed at least 33 lives, you've had really knee-jerk reactions from public Egyptian media figures. So, for example, the popular TV host Amr Adib came on TV, was crying on TV, expressing his support for President Sisi, calling on Sisi to reinitiate military trials, essentially for civilians.
The latest confrontation between students and universities and the security forces, most of the time these students are labeled by these talk shows as criminals, as supporters of the Brotherhood, traitors to their country and to their nation, and that they should be arrested for this reason.
طلبة الإخوان حاولوا إن هم يعني يختبروا قوة شركة فالكون، قوة نظام الأمن الجديد، قوة رؤساء الجامعة، قوة الدولة المصرية.
It's very sad to see that Egyptian media is back to the unilateral story imposed by the government.
That's what most of the Egyptian media are doing, singing from the government's song sheet. Those who do not, be they members of the banned Brotherhood, protesters demanding the most basic freedoms, the right to express themselves, or the journalists who dare to give them a voice, all find themselves on the front lines. That idea that journalism is now the front line is the case not just in Egypt. Media rights organizations like the International Federation of Journalists in Brussels, the Committee to Protect Journalists in New York City, and Reporters Without Borders in Paris say they're seeing more and more cases of media workers being targeted and killed because of the work they do, the stories they're trying to tell. Some of the cases get more coverage than others, often because that is what the killers want. Here are stories from 7 countries where journalism is under attack and where those doing the attacking are getting away with their crimes. James Foley and Stephen Sotloff weren't just killed by ISIL in Syria, they were executed for propaganda purposes. Another 8 reporters have been killed, including Bilal Ahmed Bilal of Palestine Today TV, who, according to news outlets and human rights groups, died in prison after being tortured. Ahmed Hassan Ahmed, an Egyptian photojournalist for China's Xinhua news agency, was shot and killed. And Al-Mutaz Bella Ibrahim of the Damascus-based Sham news network was kidnapped by ISIL militants and then murdered. Of the 180 countries listed on the annual Press Freedom Index published by the Paris-based organization Reporters Without Borders, Syria ranks 177th, fourth from bottom. Reports indicate that two Iraqi journalists, Mohanad al-Akidi and Rod Mohammed al-Azawi, were also killed by ISIL in October. Another 9 reporters in Iraq were publicly threatened by ISIL militants who ordered them to stop working and join the group or face execution. According to the New York-based Committee to Protect Journalists, over the past decade, there have been 100 murders of journalists in Iraq, and all have gone unpunished. The country ranks 153rd out of the 180 on the Press Freedom Index and scores 100% on the impunity scale. When the head of Somalia's journalists union talks about a history of impunity there, he refers to cases like Abdi Rizak Jama Almi of Somali TV. He was shot 3 times in Mogadishu in October. His attackers escaped. 2 months prior to that, government forces raided and shut down 2 radio stations, both owned by the Shabelle Media Network. 2 Shabelle journalists remain in jail without trial. One of them told Al Jazeera he's been tortured. Somalia's double threat to journalism from both the gun and the government landed it at number 176 of the 180 countries on the RSF Press Freedom Index. Ukraine is at number 127 on the 2014 index, but that ranking is sure to fall. 7 journalists and media workers have been killed there this year. Rebels and fighters have shut down television and radio stations, banned reporters they don't like from the conflict zone. Ukrainian security forces have raided a pro-Russian newspaper, and many journalists, local and foreign, have found themselves detained. And nearly 100 reporters are reported to have left the Crimea area because of political pressure and fears for their safety. When 3 German photojournalists were arrested on October 11th in southeastern Turkey and accused of being spies, they were held for just 31 hours. But they weren't alone. According to the CPJ, in 2012 and 2013, Turkey was the world's leading jailer of journalists. The Istanbul-based independent press agency Bianet says attacks by security forces on 153 reporters covering last year's protests in Gezi Park remain unpunished. Turkey is at number 154 on the index. Corruption and drug trafficking make Mexico one of the most perilous countries in the world for journalists. 2 have been murdered there this year, 26 this decade. The number of reporters murdered is down over the past 3 years, but the Committee to Protect Journalists says that is partly due to the self-censorship that has taken hold in virtually every corner of the nation. And killings go unpunished. 90% of the cases remain unsolved. Mexico ranks 152nd out of the 180 countries on the index. At the very bottom of the RSF Press Freedom Index is Africa's worst jailer of journalists, with 30 behind bars, none of whom has been openly charged with a crime or ever brought to trial. For the 6th year in a row, the bottom rung of the Press Freedom Index belongs to Eritrea. The main offender is the government, and like so many others, in so many places, it attacks the media with impunity. Back to Egypt now, and the story of the Al Jazeera reporter who got out. Abdullah al-Shami works for our Arabic language news channel and was based in Cairo. In the aftermath of the coup that toppled Mohammed Morsi, al-Shami was covering protests in Rabah, where he was arrested as part of a security crackdown that eventually rounded up and imprisoned tens of thousands. What followed for al-Shami was a nightmare. More than 300 days behind bars, despite the fact that he was never formally charged. Halfway through his jail term, al-Shami embarked on a hunger strike and wasted away. Eventually released for health reasons, he emerged from prison unrepentant and now lives in Qatar. I sat down with him to discuss his incarceration, his colleagues who are still in jail, and what remains of journalism in Egypt under President el-Sisi. Abdullah al-Shami, thanks for joining us here at the Listening Post. You're looking well, you're looking healthy.
Thank you.
Upon being released from prison, you told the crowd that was there to greet you, "I have won. Everyone who is a journalist doing his work has won through your release." Given that 3 of your colleagues remain in jail, they've been there for more than 300 days now, do you still stand by that statement?
Yes, I still stand by that statement because this is a long battle towards achieving, a total freedom atmosphere for journalism around the world, not just in Egypt. And I think every step is a win, and I believe it will help achieving the very soon release of our colleagues.
Take me back to the day that you were arrested. You were covering the rally in Rabat. Why do you think you were arrested? Was it that rally in particular? Was it the organization that you were working for? Was it your reporting or the reporting of the people you were working with? Do you even know?
Actually, it's quite a story. I mean, the way I was arrested, I was almost, out of the square of where the demonstration was taking place, and just like at the last checkpoint, because there were quite a few checkpoints on your way out of the area. So this army officer stops me and asks for my ID, and I just had on me my passport, an Egyptian passport, and then, well, of course, I didn't want to hold my Al Jazeera ID at that moment because it wouldn't help me. So he started flipping through the page, and then he sees a lot of visas. He kind of asks, so why are you traveling a lot? That was the question that came up, and I said, well, I love traveling. It's just about me. Of course, I don't want to bring up the issue of being a journalist. So he says, well, I think you're a spy. They took me and put me along with other groups of people who've been detained at that time, and then that's how the 309 days journey started.
309 days behind bars. Your colleagues, the Al Jazeera 3, who are still in prison, have just gone over the 300-day mark. Can you give us an idea of what their state of mind is, having been there yourself?
Well, I think, the whole idea of being in prison itself is actually very hard to grasp. Freedom is something that we are born with, so it's something like, like air and water and food. It's something that, we can't live without. So the moment you put behind bars, you have to adapt to stay in a very limited space. You have to adapt to the fact that you're not allowed to move freely. It's one thing that I believe would get to the point of madness if you don't really, try and get yourself together.
One of the most compelling aspects of your story was the video that was shot of you inside the jail that you somehow managed to smuggle out.
I have been detained for 266 days without any charge.
How did you manage to do that?
Well, in Egypt, money does everything.
Did you bribe a jail guard to shoot it?
It wasn't actually me. It was some of my prison inmates. They were actually, they were able to smuggle a phone, and then I had the idea of this whole video thing because I was at that point almost 3.5 months in my hunger strike, and I thought this would, well, at least if this gets to the no return point, this would be the only proof, because for people to believe, they have to see.
Unlike their case, the Al Jazeera 3, you were never formally charged with a crime, were you? I mean, they actually went through a trial of sorts. There was evidence presented, a judgment rendered, and a sentence levied. If that really was the show trial that some people have called it, what was the intended audience? What was the target audience of that trial?
I think the whole trial itself, when it came to my colleagues, was mostly targeted at journalists who are working in the country, either local or foreign journalists. It was meant to convey a message to the outer world that, well, if you work by your own rules, you will have, well, you will be able to work in the country. I wouldn't say freely, but we wouldn't disturb you. But if you don't, then you know how it goes. I also remember that in my own case, when some officials would come to me and say, well, we don't have a problem with you as Al Jazeera. We know that you don't say wrong things, but our problem is you guys make a lot of noise. I mean, when there's a problem on the street, and we know there's a problem, but you guys speak about it a lot. So you kind of giving us trouble in governing our own people.
They want less noise.
They want less noise. They want no noise at all, if necessary.
Apart from the Al Jazeera staff, there are other Egyptian journalists who languish in jail, accused of spreading false news, spreading chaos in one case. Names like Sami, Mustafa, Abdullah, al-Fakarni, Muhammad al-Adli, others such as Mahmoud Abu Zayd were arrested while covering the same Rabat sit-in that you were at. Explain the rationale behind those charges and how they've been interpreted in the domestic media. What kind of coverage are Egyptians seeing of those cases, if any?
I remember those names you mentioned. We stayed in jail together for about 5 months. When it came to the coverage outside, if it was in the newspapers or in the channels or any media outlet in Egypt, there would always be that rhetoric about the judiciary have to do what they have to do, nothing we can do about it. And the thing is, it's not, usually you have this saying of everyone is innocent till they're proven guilty, but in Egypt it's like you're guilty till proven innocent. And that happened in the case of Samhi, Abdullah and Muhammad Al-Adli, who are from Raz News Network, an independent website in Egypt. They were just actually visiting a friend, and then suddenly they find out themselves, having all those list of charges. And very unfortunately, the media, outside doesn't dare speak freely about the whole thing.
The story of your incarceration and of the Al Jazeera 3 seems to be part of the conflict that exists between the Egyptian authorities and Qatar. Did you feel like a pawn in that struggle? And do you think that's what your colleagues who are still in jail are?
I think the whole thing is not just about Qatar. It's about, let's say, the cause of press freedom. I know this might be a bit of, trying to avoid the question it might look like that, but I think it's all about the way the regime in Egypt feels towards the state of Qatar, being a host of the Al Jazeera media network. And I remember there was a question I asked one of the prison guards back in the maximum security prison where I was held for the last 37 days. And he said, well, it's all about politics. If Qatar is an ally for us, you will walk free. If this was happening with Kuwait or Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates, it would have been the same.
Still, the Egyptians have accused Qatar and Jazeera of being pro-Morsi, pro-Muslim Brotherhood. What do you think of those allegations? Do you stand by the journalism that the network on its various platforms was producing at the time?
Well, I think there's no any kind of, let's say, neutrality when it comes to journalism. Look at my own stories. I covered things from Tahrir Square, where the pro-regime supporters were camping for 3 days. I covered from Rabaa. I covered from the Nile Delta, where also the regime supporters were camping during the whole political turmoil. So my own thing as a journalist, on a personal level and a professional level, is that I like to tell both sides of the story, and I let the audience decide for themselves who is strong and who is correct.
You were in New York when President al-Sisi was in New York. You kind of had a ad hoc, personal, one-man demonstration. He was also interviewed there by Charlie Rose of CBS, who asked one question on the Al Jazeera 3. And Sisi, I think, repeated what he said before, which is, this is really unfortunate. I wish it hadn't have happened. But it is not for me as an elected official to interfere with Egypt's independent judicial process. What do you make of that?
I think that's all lies, because I would say, based on my own personal experience, that the whole persecution and judicial system in Egypt is very corrupt. I'm not being actually aggressive towards the system here, based on my experience, but I would speak of personal things I have seen. I have seen cases in which people were detained on a scene of a demonstration or something else, and will be released from police station while paying money to the officers. And I've seen that also happen on a level of persecution. The whole thing about talking about free judiciary and that it's an independent thing is actually not true at all, because facts speak for themselves. I remember when I was back in New York and I was having an interview with a media outlet, and they asked me, what would you say to President Sisi about the situation in the country, when it comes to press, freedom of press? I said I wouldn't say a lot of things. I would just say, look at the facts. We have people who have been, killed while doing their work as journalists, people who have been detained, people who are actually languishing in prison for over a year, and others who've been forced to either flee out of the country or go in hiding.
Abdullah al-Shami, we're grateful for the time that you spent with us today. Here's hoping that one day perhaps we can have 3 more chairs here and consign this to the dustbin of history, as they say.
Let's hope that happens very soon.
You've been watching a special edition of our program coming to you from Doha to mark International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists. We'll be back next week with more coverage of news coverage as we continue to monitor the global media. We'll see you then here at the Listening Post.